Hello again. In the 1950s and 1960s, it was taken for granted that when immigrants arrived in Britain and the United States, they would do their best to fit in with the ways of their new home country and behave like everybody else who was already living there. After all, America had always been a nation of immigrants. The Irish, the Italians, Russian Jews, and others from across the world. Until 1956, the motto of the United States was E pluribus unum, out of many, one. The expression common in the years following the end of the Second World War was the melting pot. The idea being that immigrants surrendered their own quirky ways and became Americans, indistinguishable from anybody else. Britain followed the same doctrine, and in this country people would say of immigrants, when in Rome you do as Rome does. In other words, immigrants arrived and they behaved like us. By and large, immigrants followed this idea in both countries. In Britain, Indians arriving in the 1950s often became exaggeratedly British, embracing our customs and way of life with a vengeance. The name of the game in those days, both here and on the other side of the Atlantic, was integration, or fitting in. In the United States, all this changed in the late 1970s and 1980s, and it began to be said that integration was really just a manifestation of white supremacism. After all, why should arriving foreigners adopt the Western way of life? Was Christianity, to take one example, any better than Islam or Buddhism? What right had we to impose our way of life on people who had different beliefs and a different way of life from us? Why couldn't they maintain their identity? Perhaps we could learn from them. So it was that the concept of the melting pot was abandoned and replaced instead with that of the salad bowl. Instead of surrendering their culture, being submerged in the American way of life, immigrants were now to be encouraged to keep their own traditions and follow the way of life which best suited them and fitted in with their own belief system, whatever that might be. This is the concept of multiculturalism. As the old saying has it, America sneezes and we in Britain catch a cold. So it was that in the 1980s, integration became a dirty word in this country too, and we too began to celebrate the idea of multiculturalism. Today, this is the only game in town, and it would be a brave person who suggested that immigrants should start following the British way of life when they come to Britain. Why should they? Their own way of life is just as good as ours, right? There are 2 points to consider. The first is, of course, that multiculturalism has never been a recipe for success anywhere in the world. The most stable and peaceful countries are those which have not embraced multiculturalism, the ones where there is just one religion, one language, one ethnic group, all living in one nation. I have in the past given any number of examples of countries which have contained substantial minorities who follow a different religion or have a different language or ethnicity from the majority. Places like Israel, Nigeria, Burma and so on. They tend not to be peaceful places. The other point to consider should have been obvious to those advocating multiculturalism. It's all well and good encouraging immigrants to follow their own way of life and respecting all the different ideas and so on. But what if the ideas which they follow are diametrically opposed to the values of the country to which they are coming to live? Britain and America are both democracies, but what is going to be the result if people come and live in democracies and don't themselves agree with or approve of democracy? We see this with militant Muslims who wish to impose a theocracy and who reject utterly the idea of democracy. What happens if you have an immigrant population whose traditional way of life entails marriages between cousins or female circumcision? Suppose that a community approves of child abuse or religious intolerance. We've seen all those things, of course, and there's little sign that the problems created by our current approach are fading. Quite the opposite, in fact. Some of us think that multiculturalism has failed and that we should return to the more sound idea of integration, and that immigrants coming here should either do as we do or find another country to live in. It is probably not too late to do something about the terrible state in which multiculturalism has left us, but it is to be doubted that any politicians on either side of the Atlantic have the appetite or courage for such a bold move. Which, alas, means that the steady decline we've seen in the safety and stability of both Britain and America is likely to continue, and indeed accelerate.